Architecture represents the beauty of the resurrection. The church is a representation of the New Jerusalem. There's a certain dignity and a beauty to a place. It subconsciously affects what we believe.
Welcome to the EDIFY podcast, where our guests share practical wisdom on living our faith in public. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the EDIFY podcast. Our guest today is Erik Bootsma, who is a Catholic architect. Welcome, Erik. Thanks for being with us today.
Happy to be here with you.
Well, how did you get into architecture?
Well, I guess it was kind of fated to happen. I always like to say is my dad was a contractor, so he built things. And then my mom was a painter. And she painted with oil paints, all sorts of things, a lot of times buildings. But I think these two things sort of were melded together, sort of like a Reese's peanut butter cup of architecture coming out of that artistic and practical side. And that's kind of really what I got interested in. And when I was in my undergraduate at Thomas Aquinas College, my freshman mathematics, really geometry professor said, "Hey, you're pretty good at this geometry thing. Have you ever thought about architecture?" And then I guess it just kind of clicked. And so then, since then, that's all I've really done.
Well, it's a very interesting field, and I think very popular. If you just look at, either HGTV or any of the other creative channels, on the cable networks, the home shows and the building shows are really super popular. And it seems to appeal to a lot of people. I think building something and creating structures that you point out in your remarks are welcoming and, consoling for people in a way, I guess.
Right. Well, I think it's just human nature that we shape the places that are around us, because that really is kind of our habitat, really is. As human beings, we are creatures that create things, create a place and create a home, a place that we can feel secure, the place where we can feel comfortable. And I think it's throughout everyone. I don't think anyone just says, you just give me whatever for a house, I'll live in a cell. And really, I mean, that's the sort of the horror of being in prison, is being in a place that's really plain and cold and not home to you.
I have a friend who recently visited Poland, and he went to both Krakow and to Warsaw, and he said the difference was just so striking in the architecture, because, of course, Warsaw, so much of it was destroyed during the war, but then rebuilt by the communists. And there's no beauty in the buildings. He said, it's like you're in a black and white film, just looking at gray, ugly building after gray, ugly building. And in contrast, you go to Krakow, where there's that beautiful cathedral and there's beautiful architecture. For him, it was really a reflection on the difference between what people build when they live in a free society and then what communism does. And it's reflected in the buildings that the people themselves build.
Well, right. I think it really does come out from a philosophy of Marxism has a philosophy that if the communist revolution was to happen, we would create this new man, and this new man was somebody who was adapted to this new industrial world that we had. Modernist architecture basically took that premise and said that there's this new industrial man, and that we are going to build the buildings which are appropriate to him. So the places that the new industrial man will feel at home, feel comfortable with, the places that they would actually call beautiful, to use Corbusier's argument, were going to be these places which were industrial. And so they were the ones that were going to be built according to these industrial principles. So concrete and steel instead of wood and natural materials. And then they'd also be sort of warehoused together, as they would all be, similar sort of cogs in this wheel of this new industrial state that they were creating. And so when you treat people as if they are just part of this utilitarian revolution, then naturally that sort of comes out of that. And you see that contrasted between the old architecture there and the new. And so the old architecture was the places that people really love there. Again, it's the places that are dedicated to God. But it's also, just simple homes too. In Poland, throughout Europe, they're very well cared for. They're a place that feels very individual, even though they can be just the same as anything else. But there's very much a place where people feel they're at home.
Right. And when, there's a book, it came out a few years ago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's called The Not So Big House. And
Yes.
it's a critique of, mega mansions or McMansions or whatever they call them, that
Correct.
you actually lose beauty. And more is not necessarily more when you just want to create something large for the sake of it being large. And that actually the more beautiful and welcoming homes tend to be on the more reasonably small side.
Right. Yeah, I'm familiar with that book. That's great. I think it's Sarah Suzanka is the author of
Right.
that one.
Oh,
And
right. She's an
yeah, I mean,
architect. Yeah, she and her husband, right?
yeah, an architect, I think, in Minnesota. And I think that's that very sort of, well, for me, I mean, I come from my family, my dad's Dutch, and so we come from a very sort of practical sort of side of things, so that things tend to be very small there and very, you only sort of build what you need to build. That's the kind of, I mean, I'm a convert, but the rest of my family comes from that very Calvinist sort of ideals of, just work and do things, just be very practical and frugal with what you're doing. So I'm sort of used to that idea of things being smaller and being able to be comfortable and cozy. That's the very Dutch sort of idea of coziness.
So the quality over quantity argument.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so then it becomes a much more of a place of your own that way. So,
yeah. Well, so this is kind of a third rail question, but I'd like to talk to you a little bit about church architecture and
Sure.
specifically Catholic church architecture. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, and so much of the commentary focused on the buildings in which these services for her, throughout Scotland and then England, took place, particularly Westminster Abbey and then St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and the history and the beauty and the art and the altarpieces. You could see people were really very much drawn to the beauty of those buildings, and that really seemed to not dominate the conversation, but it absolutely was a big part of it. Why do you think that is? That when you're laying, a great queen as she was to rest, that so much of the attention is focused on the buildings in which all of these tributes happened?
Well, there's a certain sort of appropriateness to it that there's an appropriate place to have a funeral. There's an appropriate architecture for these things, which, the queen is more than just a woman. She's also sort of a symbol of a nation. She's the head of state, and she is, for all intents and purposes, she is the United Kingdom. So she's the embodiment of that. And so when she died, you can see the sort of tremendous outpouring of love and support that the people of the United Kingdom gave, and their genuine sadness about this, because she was very symbolic of that. And so when you put her to rest, those places need to both reflect on the honor that we would give to a king or a queen, but also reflect on the faith that she also represented as the head of the Church of England, of a Christian church, that she was also very faithful, and so the faith there is also reflected in the architecture. So it is that architecture represents the beauty of the resurrection, really. And so if we could get into I could get into the weeds about the theology of it, but basically the church is a representation, as Dennis McNamara says, of the New Jerusalem. And so when we're having a funeral in a church like that, we're representing that we have this faith that whoever has died will be resurrected again in the New Jerusalem and join Christ there. So, and we can see that in those magnificent churches, such as at Windsor and at Westminster. But we can also see it in the very simplest sort of churches. I've been studying a lot lately, just very simple English country chapels, and even there's a certain dignity and a beauty to a place.
Oh, and they're absolutely charming. And I think if you look at modern, I live in Chicago, so we have a lot of, after the 1960s, we had quite a large number of modern new churches built. And though it's very interesting when brides go to get married, They almost
Right.
never willingly choose to be married in those churches. They want to be married at
Right.
the beautiful St. James Chapel downtown, which is modeled on Sainte-Chapelle in France. They want to
Yeah.
be married. You want like St. George's Chapel at Windsor, right? You don't want
Right.
to be married in something that looks like an airplane hangar, and drawn to that kind of beauty during important moments in their life. So why do you think? I mean, what happened in the 60s and I guess part of the 70s, you'd have to throw that in there too, with church architecture? Why did it so dramatically go in the opposite direction? And why do you, or do you, what do you think that affects the way people worship, the type of church where they are?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. There's a certain sort of, when people have significant events in their life, they want the surroundings that they have to be significant. And so I think that's the attraction that people have. Weddings and funerals and baptisms, those are the things that people are always, they want to find the appropriate setting for the place that they are doing it. So find a home for that ceremony, to find that. But really what happened in the Catholic Church, in the 20th century, modernism and in general, modernist architecture really kind of took over, and it became a cultural phenomenon. And so by the time the 1950s came along, the Catholic Church had seen that basically modernism had taken over everywhere. So any new government buildings, any new commercial buildings, many new houses, although not all of them, were all being built in this modernist style. And so there were many in the church who thought that the church was becoming irrelevant and it was becoming some sort of a dinosaur. And so to get with the times, to get with and be relevant to everyone else, they embraced this modernism in church architecture as well. And so along with that, there was a new movement to reform the liturgy and change the liturgy in the liturgical movement, and then the liturgical conference, which was a group of priests and liturgists out in Minnesota at Collegeville. And so in the 1950s, they built a church called St. John's at St. John Collegeville. It's the chapel for the whole university and for the monastery there. And if you look at that church, you can see this full-throated embrace of both modernism and of modern liturgy that they built there. And it's very curious is that this was built in the 1950s. So this is 10 years even before Vatican II. So already the church is basically embracing this as a cultural phenomenon and trying to be relevant to it. But the problem is it really appropriate for the church and for the liturgy? Does it actually reflect the things that we're trying to teach? And so when the Catholic Church talks about architecture, when it talks about churches, as it does in a little bit in Sacrosanctum Concilium in Vatican II, but in the dedication rite of the church, it says that a church is a sign and a symbol of heavenly realities. And as I mentioned before about this heavenly New Jerusalem, the church, at least in the old form, the traditional form that's been handed down to us, the form of the nave and the sanctuary, of the main body of the church and then the sanctuary where the altar is and where the priests are when they're offering up sacrifices and offering up the Eucharist on the altar, that traditional form goes back to the temple and the tabernacle of the Old Testament. Now, in the tabernacle and the temple, there is a nave and a sanctuary, essentially a larger place, and then the Holy of Holies, as it's called. And in the Holy of Holies, that's where God is actually present. God comes down in the form of a cloud, in the form of this column of fire or cloud. He comes down there and he says, I will sit here, and my law will be there in the Ark of the Covenant. And then this gets transformed into the church. And so in the church, once the New Testament, we have the New Testament, it transforms from just a place where God comes down in this form of a cloud, so God is truly present there. God is truly present in Christ in the Eucharist, and in the Mass there when the Eucharist is there, we're celebrating this Mass, and so we have the real presence of God, and so that traditional form really had been preserved all the way up until the 20th century. And in the middle of the 20th century, they started to abandon this. And they said, there's no distinction between nave and sanctuary. There's no distinction between the laity and the priesthood. There's no distinction between what's going on here. And then they took the tabernacle and they moved it off into a corner.
And they moved the altar
said that
rails. Yeah.
Right. And so what happened is God is no longer present there. He's present there in the Mass when the Mass is occurring, but not in a very deep and symbolic way. And so this presence of God becomes absent to us. And it becomes to most people who don't, they go to Mass, they come every Sunday, they don't immerse themselves in theology and philosophy, in liturgy. They just go there and they come and they take communion and they listen and they pray, and most people are very devout. But not having the tabernacle there, not having a sanctuary there, subconsciously affects what we believe. And so it leads us to believe that God's not actually truly present there, because he's not present there. And so is it any wonder then that, among other reasons, that this led to a lack of belief in the true presence of God.
That's a really interesting point, because it's so do you think then that architecture does influence liturgy and worship? I mean, it's I occasionally put on Joel Osteen's worship services. I find it's interesting that they worship in a former what it was, the Compaq Center, right? The Houston Astros, the stadium, correct? And so you have a former stadium, and I always find it kind of amusing that occasionally he will say, if there's talking going on or whatever, he'll say, remember, you're in the Lord's house, and, you need to keep a respectful tone. And, you want to laugh because you're thinking, no, you're in a stadium. Do you know what I mean? Like, obviously they've renovated and things, but so do you think, and of course they would not have the same perspective on sacramental life, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And they don't have a sacramental theology. So I know we're talking about apples and oranges, but I do find, I'm not at all surprised people would be joking and talking and, in that kind of atmosphere rather than coming in with sort of a quiet reverence.
Yeah, I think it does affect that. It definitely is. I'm thinking of an example in secular architecture of this. When I was working here in Washington, D.C., my old boss, Milton Grenfell, was a great architect, and he was telling me about how when they renovated the state capital of Mississippi, where he was from, for about a 2 or 3 year period, they closed down the Capitol, so they were redoing the entire, making it beautiful again. So the Senate and the House met in a gymnasium in the nearby high school. And somebody asked him, how did this affect how they acted? Did it affect it at all? He said, absolutely it did. They started acting like they were in high school in a gymnasium, rather than being conducting themselves with the dignity that the building itself represented. So the building itself had this sort of deep dignity that when you came into it, you couldn't help but being acting in a dignified way. So when you build a church out of a stadium, of course it does. It makes that happen. Also sort of thinking about too, is somebody had talked about, I think there was a library at Yale where commonly freshmen will walk into this, and it's built in this Gothic style, and they'll find out, freshmen come in the first week, and usually the Catholics come in there, they start to genuflect once they come into the library.
Interesting.
They're sort of used to it because it feels like a church, but so the architecture definitely does. I mean, it affects everything, and it's usually at a very subconscious level, but it is. When you're surrounded by things that are treated with dignity, you tend to treat those things with dignity as well. It's not always the case, but in general.
Well, Tommy, this is kind of a putting you on the spot question, but what do you think architecturally is the most beautiful church in the United States? And then what would be the most beautiful church architecturally in the world that, I know that's a personal thing and a lot of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but what churches do you think are exemplary in this regard?
I get asked this a lot, and it's always a very difficult question because there's just so many places that, number one, I've been to and have just been awe-inspiring and beautiful. But I'll say, since I'm here in Washington, D.C., I really love the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. It's good. St. Matthew's, though, is absolutely outstanding. It's one of my favorite churches anywhere, and I was just in it this morning, and it is just the mosaic work, the paintings in there are just magnificent. I've never been to St. Louis, but everyone tells me St. Louis is amazing. In St. Louis, Missouri, the Cathedral of St. Louis. Another one, St. Paul in St. Paul, Minnesota. It is just one of the most magnificent and beautiful churches here. So we have just great examples here in the United States. My alma mater, where I went to Thomas Aquinas College, they just built a new church. Duncan Stroik, who was a former employer of mine, finished that up about 10 years ago now. It's absolutely magnificent. Another architect who works here in Washington, D.C., it teaches at Catholic U, James McCreary, has just finished a few churches in St. Mary of the Sorrows in Virginia. Northern Virginia is just great too.
What do you think of the new cathedral? It's not new now. It's 20 years old, but the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, of course, they had St. Vibianus, which was, I think, like St. Matthew's, just simply so limited in size. They really did need a bigger worship space. But what do you think of that? Because that was kind of upheld at the time as, the best of the old and the new in terms of architecture.
Certainly, it's better than, I think, a number of churches that I've seen, but it has a certain sort of utilitarianism to the interior, a very sort of plainness to it. Plainness in and of itself is not terrible. I mean, Cistercian architecture is definitely very plain and very devoid of extraneous ornament, but it has a very curious liturgical emphasis to it in that the whole floor sort of slopes down to the sanctuary, which is at the bottom. And then the sanctuary is not lifted up at all. And again, it's that idea that the lack of distinction between sanctuary and nave is really kind of the most troubling parts of it, and the lack of sort of dignity given to that special place that really is a traditional but a very symbolic element to a church. And really, as far as I'm concerned, it's really sort of essential. And so it's one of those things it's when that's missing, you're essentially not building a Catholic church. You really should be building something that has a significant sanctuary as almost a significant different space.
Well, just as we wrap things up here, where do you see the state of architecture in 50 years in terms of church architecture? And what do you think are the chances of there being sort of another renaissance to go back to the more sacred expressions of liturgy that are reflected in the buildings?
Well, I think there's certainly been a great resurgence in architects who are able to build in a traditional way. There's a greater understanding of how architecture and the liturgy relate to each other, how the symbolism and the theology of the church. People such as Duncan Stroik, who I mentioned, he's been writing about church architecture now for close to 30 years. Benedictine College, they're starting a program in traditional architecture. They are really teaching a next generation of architects out there in order to build in a very beautiful, meaningful, symbolic way, and how to use traditional architecture to build traditional churches, and so that they reflect those real truths of the church. So I think we're heading in the right direction on all of that. I think there's a lot less desire I see among the priests that I work with. There's a great desire to build in at least very traditional liturgical manner. Again, that nave and sanctuary manner that they build. So I see this all across the country. The churches the priests who are of the coming generation and the ones who are around my age are all sort of heading towards that direction.
Podcast. Well, I'm glad we could end on such an encouraging note. This has really been a fascinating conversation. I'm Mary Fiorito. Thank you again for helping to edify us so that we can in turn edify our fellow Americans. It's been a pleasure to have a conversation with you.
Likewise. Thank you for having me, and it's been a great day. Thanks.